Two-state solution or a two-face solution? Last night there were announcements out of Qatar that there was a hostage deal, but no sooner than it was published, it was denied, and soon the whole deal was off. The previous deal, which saw some hostages released after around 50 days, was considerably simpler than any deal that would be required at this stage in the war. By now, Hamas's forces have been even more substantially depleted, so the hostages are all the more important to ensure against the terror group's complete defeat. And that's where the weird Western desire to recognise a terror state might come in. At first, it seems confusing that David Cameron is expressing a sudden desire for Britain to recognise Palestinian statehood. It's a nonsensical U-turn on what's been British policy forever. And it's not just Cameron who suddenly seems keen to support the foundation of a state which meets none of the requirements for recognition. The US has also started to hint in that direction. It could all be part of ongoing negotiations to release the hostages. This time round, any deal won't be a straight two-way exchange, hostages for terrorist prisoners and a pause in fighting. This time, the deal will need to work in multiple directions. If Hamas is so weakened its survival is finally in question, what might motivate it to release hostages is the idea that it could possibly save itself and also that it could claim renewed relevance by bringing about the recognition of Palestinian statehood. So in order to release hostages, it might well demand that Britain and America recognise a potential Palestinian state. That way, the suffering it caused won't be seen as having been entirely in vain. But how could Israel entertain that idea? How could Israel accept repulsive and vicious terrorism being rewarded in that way? If Israel is to tolerate its allies recognising Palestinian statehood, especially now, it'll need something in return. Something like the Saudi normalisation that seemed to be on the horizon just before Iran-backed Hamas invaded and slaughtered Israelis in their homes. And Joe Biden would certainly like to oversee that normalisation and a possible end to the fighting in order to claim some level of success before the US election. Without that, it's hard to see how he can be seen as anything short of a massive failure in the region, having gone weak on Iran, cozied up to Qatar, who sent vast funds to Hamas, and generally contributed to a situation in which all of this happened in the first place. So maybe that's why David Cameron seems to be rewarding terrorism with national recognition for a state which will most likely become a terror state very quickly. But all of this is very precarious. What exactly does recognition mean anyway? And how can the UK sell that to the Palestinians without totally betraying Israel? How can Israel feel sure it'll be protected and even maintain the international support it has to defend itself against its vicious, bloodthirsty, anti-Semitic enemies? And how can the Palestinians be sure that the UK and the US won't simply go back on recognition? Without these and other questions carefully considered, nobody will agree to the deal. Whatever recognition means, it's clear that recognising a Palestinian state in response to the horrific attacks Palestinians carried out in October last year will be a bad thing in the long term. It would send a signal to all terrorists, especially Iranian-backed ones, that violence works, but only if carried out on the most extreme and dreadful level. It would send a signal that diplomacy and efforts to make peace don't work. It would send the signal that statehood is not earned, but given as a sweetener out of fear. And any state formed in that way will behave so much worse when it achieves statehood than it did during its efforts to get to that point. Getting back the hostages is so important. That's why we could understand why the West would do almost anything to achieve it. But some things are hard to undo, and short-sighted decision-making made at gunpoint is never likely to work out well in the long term. The higher the price paid to rescue the hostages now, the higher the value of the next wave of hostages taken. We should have learnt that by now. And would-be states which readily sacrifice their own people and kill, kidnap and torture ours will never behave in a way that deserves recognition if it comes as a reward for that very terrorism. For a multi-dimensional deal to work, it has to be permanent and complete. It can't be aborted partway through like last time, because too many things will have changed already. Once recognition's been placed on the table, it's hard to take it back. Once fighting has ceased for 40 days or more, it's not certain that it can be recommenced with the same military advantage or international support. Even with some hostages returned, the existence of even a few still in captivity will only increase the cost of their release and the ability for the terrorists to use them for more psychological torture and extortion. Once you pull the tablecloth, you can't know exactly where all the dishes are going to land.